Hi everyone, today's SEDIL webinar is the last SEDIL webinar for the year before the Christmas break. Today we have a presentation from a team by the ISDC, jointly ISDC, which is the International Security Development Center based in Berlin, and the American University in Beirut. And they will present on a project called Seeds for Recovery, which is an agricultural intervention, and quite a traditional agricultural intervention, but implemented in a conflict area in Syria. And so it's particularly interesting for the context, and also the type of data that they collected, and including the methodology that the team use. And so we have quite a large team of speakers. I will introduce them very briefly. So we're going to have the principal investigator, who's Ghassan Baliki, who's a program director at ISDC. Tilman Brook, who is a founder and director of ISDC, Professor Tilman. Then we have Ala Gattas, who's associate professor at the American University in Beirut. And we have Lara Sajud, who's a research fellow at American University in Beirut as well. After the presentation that will be shared between the four members of the team, we will have a discussion, and Hania Shalal will provide some comments. Hania is a business export coach from the Center for Promoting Imports from Developing Countries, which is based in the Netherlands. And after that, we can have we can answer a few other questions. And so for the audience, we really welcome your questions, and but we're not going to give you can't ask your question directly. We would like you to type your questions either in the Q&A or in the chat function. So if you see at the bottom of the screen, there is a Q&A and chat function. So you can please type your questions there. We make sure that those questions will be answered. I have to remind you that the event is recorded, and also that the event is supported by SEDIL, which is a project funded by FCDO, and the program is supported by UK Aid. At the end of the seminar, you will have the opportunity to provide some feedback. There is an evaluation form that will pop up at the end before you close the Zoom page, and thank you. Please do give us some feedback, and rate the session, or any feedback would be very useful, and it's been useful in the past for us for improving our work. Okay, I think that's all for me, and I will then ask, I believe Ghassan is it maybe the first to start? No, Hala. So please, Hala, over to you, and thank you for presenting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eduardo. Welcome, everybody. We're going to be presenting from the Seeds for Recovery project that was very generously funded by SEDIL. I'm going to start by giving a bit of a background on the state of the evidence and the context of Syria. Ghassan will then discuss the research design and results of the impact evaluation of this agricultural intervention in Syria. And then Lara will present results from using remote sensing and machine learning to estimate impact. And Tilman will discuss the policy implications of this work. And then Hania will discuss lessons learned and implications of this work. Next, please, Ghassan. Thank you. And I also just wanted to invite everybody to a workshop that we are going to be running in January. It will be online from the 17th to the 19th. Which is actually focusing on conducting rigorous impact evaluations in humanitarian emergencies and conflict settings. So really trying to think about the methods and the implications of, or if you want, some of the limitations and barriers that conflict settings could present to some of this research, and some ways to get around this. So please do join us. You can get more information from the ISDC website. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the state of the evidence, which we have collated from several systematic reviews and then a systematic review that we've been conducting, and give you a little bit of an intro on the context within which we've been working. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what is it that we know about these contexts? What we know is that violent conflict actually drives about 80% of all humanitarian needs globally, and are clearly causally linked to food insecurity in both directions. So food insecurity can drive conflict, and conflict can increase food insecurity. And by about 2030, it's estimated that, excuse me, half of the world's poorest people will live in fragile and conflict-affected settings. And so there is actually quite a bit of evidence on the impact of agricultural interventions on food insecurity, nutrition, and welfare. And in fact, the evidence from rigorous impact evaluations is on the increase. There are 5 systematic reviews that we found that have actually summarized the evidence on nutrition-sensitive agricultural interventions more broadly, dating all the way back from 1985 to the most recent one, which was published in 2018 by Marie Ruel and colleagues. However, none of these actually focused on fragile and conflict-affected settings, but I do want to share with you what it is we know from this literature. Next slide, please, Hassan. Thank you. So the early evidence prior to the most recent systematic review actually highlighted that agricultural interventions can increase clearly production of agricultural goods, but that actually translates into an improvement in dietary diversity and income generated by households, that agricultural interventions can facilitate women's contribution to household food availability, and that they can lead to a slight increase in the consumption of foods rich in protein, vitamin A, and micronutrients, particularly in women and children. However, there's an unclear effect on overall diet and very little evidence on the effect on downstream nutritional outcomes such as stunting, wasting, and underweight. And the more recent systematic review actually showed very similar results. What it did show is that there is more literature that is actually using more rigorous methods to evaluate the impacts of agricultural interventions on these downstream effects. And again, largely showing improvements in diet diversity, also women's empowerment, some evidence of the improvement in the delivery of micronutrient fortified products targeted to young children. Sorry, there's a typo there. And then again, very little evidence on the effect on stunting, wasting, and underweight. Next slide, please, Hassan. However, what we don't know is whether these kinds of impacts would be similar in conflict-affected or humanitarian settings. And there is really a huge lack of data, largely due to various security and ethical concerns, practical challenges for both implementers and researchers. As you can imagine, in humanitarian contexts, the humanitarian imperative comes first, emergency assistance, etc. And so it's very difficult to build in rigorously designed impact evaluations in these kinds of contexts. And so we have weak insight on how interventions can best support people's welfare in that kind of setting, and also how these interventions interact with the context. So with conflict or post-conflict, and also whether we would see immediate or longer term effects. Next slide, please, Hassan. What we actually then did was just update these systematic reviews and zoom in and focus on humanitarian contexts. And when we did that, we actually only found 14 studies that actually did this work in either conflict or humanitarian contexts. 8 of those were within a setting affected by conflict, 2 in post-conflict settings, and then 4 in settings that have experienced extreme climatic shocks. And again, our results from this follow-on systematic review show that agricultural interventions in these settings can increase crop and livelihood diversification. Again, they can lead to an improvement in food and total household expenditure. A couple of studies found no effect on wealth in the absolute, which is not surprising. They've led to sort of consistently found improved access to food. In this case, most of these studies looked at household food insecurity access at the household level. Most found an increase in diet diversity, except for one study, and a subset of these studies actually zoomed in on protein-rich foods and found that those were also increased as a result of these interventions. But again, from the studies that we were able to review, no significant impact on nutritional status outcomes such as stunting and wasting. Next slide, please, Hassan. And as I said, actually, maybe I forgot to mention it, but all the studies that we found that were focusing on humanitarian contexts were actually conducted in sub-Saharan Africa. But the Syrian crisis has actually been described as the largest humanitarian crisis of modern times since the Second World War. And as many of you know, the Syrian conflict erupted in 2011. It displaced about 6.5 million people within Syria and over 5 million people as refugees across borders. And within this context, there were over time constantly changing political control or political boundaries within Syria, making it very difficult to access many of these areas, both for assistance, but also to be able to evaluate this assistance. And then there have also been changing climatic conditions with recent increases in drought. And then most recently, there's been a currency collapse combined with all sorts of other sort of systematic failures leading to power cuts and gas shortages. So in this context, sort of conflict, climate, all these economic factors intersect to really worsen livelihoods and welfare of rural Syrians. And this is the context within which the Seeds for Recovery project was conducted. Next slide, please, Hassan. So the overarching objectives of Seeds, we had, oh, sorry, I don't know what happened to the numbering. We have 3, not 3 ones. So the first was an empirical objective, really aiming to improve our understanding of both the short and the long-term impacts of agricultural interventions in protracted crisis settings, such as Syria, on household welfare and behavior. The second was a methodological objective, really trying to say, how can we conduct rigorous research within these kinds of settings? So adapting existing approaches to test novel methods for rigorous impact evaluations of complex interventions in these settings. And then the third was really to draw attention to the opportunities for impact evaluations in crisis settings and try to derive lessons learned from evidence of this specific complex intervention. So Ghassan is going to actually go into the details of the intervention and present some of the findings. Thank you.
Thank you, Hala, very much. Yes, as Hala described, so our study was built to kind of try to fill this research gap, particularly in understanding how moving from emergency support, how can agricultural intervention, small scale, with multiple aspects, can help improve nutritional and food security, as well as help households rely less on credit and build better, stronger resilience. So, what we do is we collaborated with a FAO in Syria, who have conducted an emergency and recovery support program in Syria, who was started in 2017 and ran until 2021. And as you see, this is quite a large project run by Syria across different governorates. So it's not just concentrated in certain areas. So also particularly in Deir ez-Zor, Aleppo, Idlib, Homs and Hama, as well as in the south of Syria, and also had included multiple components generally, the program, including not just the provision of seeds and seed kits, but as well as irrigation rehabilitation, as well as going to seed multiplication, animal vaccination campaigns and others. So it's quite a complex program spread across Syria. And kind of the idea was saying, okay, we know that this program is existing, and how we can build and understand what's going on and what can we learn from that. So, but of course, given this is the kind of the complex nature of both Syria in a sense and the breadth of the program, on the other hand, it makes sense to kind of start a little bit constructing and thinking, maybe testing specific methods in terms of how we can build a study around that. So in principle, today we're going to focus on two aspects of that, is looking into how we can, the provision of seeds and tools can have an impact maybe on increasing production of agriculture outputs and food security in the short term, and as well as we kind of hypothesize that might in the longer term that households will rely less on credit and have to use harmful coping strategies, so it's going to that increase in their resilience and self-reliance in the medium term. And as well, Lara later is going to speak about how the irrigation rehabilitation can also increase crop productivity in the short term, as well as looking into vulnerability to weather shocks. So in principle, we want to try to understand how these different interventions play a role and interact with the context as such. And this is something we kind of explore also further into the. So the study was built based on a quasi-experimental approach. And we came in early on with FEO to design identifying the beneficiary groups, and also we kind of selected a control group that looks very similar to the treatment group. But as you can see, and this is kind of typical for also in such settings, this is kind of the challenges where you can apply very usual, if I may, research designs that usually work in peaceful settings and can be monitored and well followed up with. One has to kind of more use adaptable kind of research design to kind of ensure that we can still rigorously evaluate the impact of these programs, but at the same time, we need to have it adaptable in the sense that with the changing nature, both of the program and the context. And you can see here, so just giving an example, so the first group of household mainly who received vegetable support in T1, we managed to follow up with them on 4 waves. So this is something that we look into the short, medium, and maybe a little bit longer time, 4 years after the program. So we have a set of panel data which we can analyze for this group of people who received this intervention, but also that given in such context settings, it's really hard to identify all beneficiaries for all types of support. So we had it within each wave to add a new sample to cover new different types of activities. So within, for example, the post-endline, which we're still analyzing as part of the CIDL, we can able maybe to kind of process all this information in a novel way to see how these different impacts for different programs. But today we're going to focus mainly on the panel study, which is more look at the seed distribution and for crop production. And just here, I want to raise the issue, and I think what Hala has mentioned, that context really matters for us. Here it shows the graph from 2016 to 2022 of the SPAY index, which measures drought. And here it shows our baseline, midline, endline, and post-endline. So this is kind of the vertical graphs. And then we see here that anything below 0 shows that there's drought. So there has been consistent drought before the baseline. So households have been facing that. And we see some also kind of changes in that, so it got better off and got worse in the again. So one has to always take into this account within agricultural interventions the changing nature of going on with the drought. Also here we look at the violent events from ACLED, and we see that also within the timeline of our project, and the violent events have been reducing more on time, and that also plays a role. And we have to take it into account to understand how impacts kind of vary across these different settings. And finally, also as Helen has mentioned, that this is the exchange rate from the black market of the Syrian pounds, which also kind of measures that since also our midline has been a huge shot into hyperinflation as well, and change in the currency, that we need to also take account to understanding the outcomes of our study. Yeah, so as you see, this is kind of what we mentioned when we talk about emergency settings, that these things are volatile, and you always have to take them into account to better understand how the program works, so to speak. And what we do for the different type of study that we conducted under the CIDL grant is we use multiple matching techniques, as you see, because we have some attrition and changes that took place from our design, so we needed to account for that. As for example, we use specifically, for example, the results I'm going to show, we use here a propensity score matching, given that we have the stronger, bigger control group, which we can account for. Also, we use more multivariate causal analysis on panel data using both difference and differential approaches and the fixed effects OLS, because we have a larger panel following with households over 4 years. And as well, we try to perform to understand heterogeneity of the analysis. We use more kind of novel and new techniques, for example, like machine learning, using the honest causal forest that help us estimate, include both how contextual factors can play a role into understanding the impacts of the program on food security. And I just want to zoom in a little bit because I thought this is something that we worked on kind of as a novelty as part of our work, and to set the methodological contributions. And the idea of this whole methodological machine learning, for testing heterogeneity, is that even in cases where we have a small sample size or we have higher attrition, we're able to usually in the case, in order to look at heterogeneity, say if you want to break the analysis between males and females, you need a larger sample size in order to see the effects that work there. So your study should have enough power and able to detect any impacts. But what this kind of machine learning helps us is that using this kind of a different tree estimating for each conditional average treatment effect at each tree. So we split our sample between the training and the testing set. And based on that, we try to maximize within each leaf based on those characteristics or these contextual factors in our case, how much the average treatment effect would be. And if we can repeat it, we do that repeatedly over different types of set on different trees, and then we always continue in estimating, so we can recycle, so to speak, our sample for these estimations, then we can grow a forest, so to speak. And based on this forest, we can then have a better estimate of the average treatment effect, conditioned on these contextual factors or the heterogeneous factors, if I may. Okay, so just quickly here, just to give kind of generalism of what we have found. We're happy to also share the papers that we've been working on. There's multiple papers to go more into the details, but I just want to try to kind of zoom in on the kind of what we thought that interesting results. So here we find that the vegetable support does work, and even it continues to work actually in the long term in a setting such as in Syria, which is something that we were not expecting as such, because given the volatility of the situation, but given that the whole worsening of the currency, we thought that even seeds that has been given in year 2019 still have positive impacts 4 years afterwards. And also something that we haven't detected early on. So in the short term and the medium term is that we didn't see that the households are relying less, for example, on harmful coping strategy, which is measured through the reduced coping strategy index. But now looking at the impacts after 4 years afterwards, we still that actually these effects are starting to take place. And I think here kind of the idea is saying that, well, households are through this very simple type of intervention, they've been over the years be able to ensure better food security, and when, as you see, that now the macroeconomic crisis hits, also as well makes them rely less. So it makes sense for us that these results appear, and we're happy that we followed up with this household 4 years after to be able to detect these results and help us inform better and learn more about these programs. And here we kind of break down to understand so less. We know that there's food consumption positive effects, but actually where it's coming, and then not surprisingly, we see it's actually from vegetable production, right? And then we see here also that increases also the vegetable consumption of households, but also that we see that even in the long term, that households, we see no effect on meat and poultry, which we didn't expect in the shorter term. To see that households are being better off, are able to consume meat and poultry also in the longer term, which is also, I think, kind of correlated with the reduced coping strategy, the improvement we see there. So this is something also positive to look at in the long term. And here, based on our heterogeneous treatment effect analysis, we're able to break down actually in a bit more detail about who benefited most from the program. And I think here we just want to give you a snapshot of kind of the results of what we can see on the x-axis. Here we show the different quintiles of exposure of violence. So here people in the low didn't get exposed to violence at all. And in the higher that you go, the people were exposed more to violence in the past year when they were interviewed. And here we divided also in the x-axis between male and female. And within each of those groups, we have, using the scale technique, we've been able to estimate how much the impact on food security was. And what's surprising, we see that households who were not affected by conflict at all did not benefit much from the program, especially also households that have been affected by conflict a lot also did not benefit from the program. The households who really benefit from the program are the ones who were invulnerable, moderate conflict exposure, which shows that such an emergency program might not be enough or sufficient for households who living in peaceful settings that might need more structural development type of programming, and living in very extreme situations having seeds might be enough for them to grow it and make the benefits out of it. So we see that this kind of program actually works for those moderate things. And we see also, which is good news, that many female-headed households benefited most from this program. Yes, so I will now give the floor to my colleague Lara to discuss about the impacts of the irrigation using remote sensing. Lara, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ghassan. So, as Ghassan mentioned, the aim of this project, of what I will talk about, is to evaluate the effectiveness of an irrigation system rehabilitation intervention in villages in Deir ez-Zor through the use of earth observation and remote sensing. Next slide, please. Okay, so as you can see on the screen, this is a vegetation index map of a village in Deir ez-Zor in Syria, showing the difference in vegetation between 2 years. One is pre-conflict, which is 2011, and another one is during conflict, which is 2014. So this map shows how it's a high-resolution image, vegetation resolution, and it shows the normalized difference vegetation index, or the NDVI, which is effective in quantifying and evaluating vegetation cover. Okay, so someone is saying the sound is really bad. I'm trying to disconnect. 1 second.
Sorry, Lara, sorry to interrupt you. We can't hear you well. Is there a way you can improve? Or maybe it's just me, but it's really hard to understand. So I don't know if you can change the microphone setting. Yes.
Is it better?
That looks better. Yes, thank you.
Okay, so as I was saying, higher NDVI values mean that it's better vegetation, and in this map, the green color has higher NDVI values, while the orange and yellow have lower NDVI values, which represent minimum vegetation or bare soil. So this just further, shows the losses due to the conflict in agriculture. Next slide, please. Okay, so the overall aim of this study is to develop a framework for evaluating the effectiveness of agricultural interventions in conflict settings with the help of remote sensing and machine learning. So this is a schematic workflow of the developed framework. Briefly speaking, we use precipitation data, satellite imagery, and apply machine learning classification. And we identify control and intervention villages. We identify control villages to disentangle the effect of the intervention from other agroecological factors. So we make sure that the control villages are similar in terms of size and agriculture productivity before conflict. We divide our study period into 3 periods: pre-conflict, which is 2000 to 2011, during conflict, 2013 to 2018, and post-intervention, which is 2020 and 2021. We obtain standardized vegetation anomalies, which were also normalized by rainfall. And we study the time series analysis using Landsat imagery, since it provides continuous and uninterrupted spatiotemporal images. And finally, we apply machine learning classification to delineate irrigated areas in target villages. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the mean NDVI during April over the years. So from 2009 until 2020, over an intervention village in Deir ez-Zor, the change in agriculture production is evident from the map. So as you can see, for example, during the conflict, the agriculture production dropped, and then post the intervention, it got better again. So to study whether there was a significant change in agriculture production during the post-intervention period, we decided to do hypothesis testing. Next slide. Okay, so first we look at the general results of all intervention villages and control villages together. When comparing these anomalies against the pre-conflict mean, both intervention and control villages do not show an overall improvement in NDVI in either season. So it's not the summer or the spring. However, when we compare the results against the conflict mean, different findings are observed. So as you can see, during the summer season, the intervention villages show an improvement in 2020, which is the year directly after the intervention. So, but not the case for 2021. Contrary to the intervention villages, there's an overall increase in NDVI for the control villages in years 2020 and 2021. During the spring season, both intervention and control villages show an overall increase post-intervention period. And the intervention villages show greater increase in NDVI as compared to the control villages. Similarly, findings from the hypothesis testing further show that during spring season, there was a significant improvement in agriculture productivity in intervention villages, but not in control villages. Next slide, please. So after analyzing the overall productivity, we analyzed the results village by village. So 3 intervention villages show a significant increase in irrigated area post-intervention as compared to only 1 control village. And 4 villages show an improvement in vegetation as compared to 2 control villages, and no improvement in the normalized difference moisture index was observed for intervention villages. These results show that in some cases, vegetation indices and irrigated area time series are not always at par for the same village. So for example, if you look at the first village, a significant increase in irrigated areas was noted, but there was no significant improvement in NDVI and NDMI values. So we find that the use of multiple indices rather than just one index reveals that results can be different and may not lead to the same conclusion. So the unsupervised machine learning algorithm better distinguishes between irrigated areas and abandoned land, since it uses a combination of indices, which when combined, the accuracy of data on vegetation stress and cover becomes better. I think my part is done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lara and all my colleagues, and also Eduardo from CEDIL for hosting this. So my name is Tilman Brook, and I want to discuss briefly with you the policy implications and some learning implications from our work. Next slide, please. On the policy side, we identified 6 interrelated lessons learned and best practices. Now, I cannot say that these are valid everywhere, so the external validity is a different issue. But in the context that we studied, these are the lessons that we found were important. First, it's important to consider long time horizons. We caution against ending programs when a crisis recedes temporarily, especially in the context of extreme macroeconomic uncertainty. So what we found is when the going was a little less tough, to put it like that, the program continued, and maybe it seemed to do less good. But then as things got worse again, which they often do, shocks tend to be negative rather than positive, the systems were in place and ready to help, and that is invaluable. Second, it's important to strengthen rural markets. Crises and conflicts and violence, and they often break things, or they destroy things, or they displace things. And that can even be visible damage. What's less visible is the damage done to markets, the functioning physically of markets, places where buyers and sellers come together, but also road networks, financial institutions, trust, communication, information. Rural markets are very complex, and these value chains need to be protected and improved. And that is important even in a crisis setting or even in a humanitarian setting, to extrapolate a little bit. Third, we can view agriculture, especially smallholder agriculture, as a social safety net. So while building resilience is a priority, it's also extremely complex, and it's a multi-dimensional process, and it takes years. We recommend that donors and policymakers and program officials and other stakeholders provide households with a range of support, reliable access to social safety nets, productive agricultural livestock assets, strengthen markets, as I said, and value chains, and where applicable, provide irrigation if possible. And that increases the adaptive capacities of the smallholder farmers, strengthens the food security, and reduces the adverse coping. So agriculture itself can act as a social safety net over and above the normal safety net, or the things that we think of as safety nets. Fourth, it can be useful to cluster intervention. Providing a little bit of something to everybody may not be the best way forward. Instead, it might be better to provide multiple intervention components to similar households in a given area to increase the synergies and the overall impact and the sustainability in the long term. It might take multiple moves to get somebody above that critical minimum asset threshold, for example, and to get them onto a path of sustainable growth, and to strengthen their resilience significantly against future shocks. Helping people only just a tiny bit, but even if you help lots of people, might not help anybody enough. Fifth, we think it's really important to invest in learning in these conflict and emergency settings. Based on what Hala said, we know relatively little. And so even the project staff and the M&E teams, they can do a lot. It's not always just researchers, you know. So you can continue doing and repeat doing evaluations, tackling different aspects, different issues, you know, being open to different methods, quantitative, qualitative, etc., to continue the learning and to realize that, you know, we can't know everything, and to do a good job, we need to constantly check the evidence. And finally, we would suggest, based on our experience in this setting, to reduce complexity on the programming side. You know, rather do fewer things, but do them really well. Because if you do a very complicated intervention with many components, it might be harder to manage. And in a fragile setting, you might want to focus on your core strength. Not to say you only do one thing. I think that would be going too far. There may, you know, in a way, there may be an optimal level of complexity or an optimal number of interventions you want to provide at one time. Next slide, please. So, in addition to these policy and program lessons, we as researchers have reflected on what we may have learned from doing this interesting project. And there are three lessons I want to offer. First is what you see here. We studied a really knotty problem, and it will be really difficult to disentangle this and to figure out what the individual components were, the different mechanisms, the causality, etc. But, and this is the good news, it was possible to do that, and it is possible. And so we want to encourage other people not to shy away from the difficult environments and the crisis settings and the humanitarian context, but rather the opposite. I think this is where the disentangling is needed, and having these knotty bunches of wool, you know, doesn't help anybody knit a nice pullover, right? So we have to disentangle these knotty problems in order to help people and to improve the world. And for that, we need to understand how this works and what the structure of the knot is. Yeah. So if we don't study these knotty problems, we're not going to make progress, and we can't just focus our research on places that are nice to visit. Yeah, that wouldn't be good. And maybe it's methodologically better to study easy context, but it doesn't help the world, and it leaves a lot of interesting knowledge questions unanswered. So that's my first lesson. Second lesson is we have to work together. Teamwork is key, right? So if you want to make it in the World Championship, you know, to an almost final stage, you have to work together, and you have to believe in what you're doing. And I think this applies here as well. And particularly not just the teamwork among us researchers, which was a lot of fun and I really value, but the teamwork between the researchers on the one hand and the practitioners on the other hand. And I think it's actually the process of working together which is valuable for both sides and has a lot of insight. It's, you know, as much fun as this webinar is and the final reports and papers will be, I think that's not what's useful for the colleagues on the ground who are delivering these interventions. They're working really hard, almost around the clock to deliver benefits to the beneficiaries and the smallholder populations. Yeah, so I think working together as a team and everybody having a role, and you know, some people play forward and some people play defensive, and you know, some on the right side, some on the left side of the field. You know, everybody's a role to play, and I think that's really important. So I think working together is my second lesson, or our second lesson from the research perspective. And then I have a third lesson, and that is that we adapted this cartoon a little bit for our purpose, but that is that we really have to collaborate and communicate, and we have to do that from the start. Yeah, so we have to come together, and it builds basically my second point. Yeah, we have to, between the implementation side and the research side, ideally we sometimes call it embed the researchers right from the beginning, so that you can plan properly. If you just one small example to drive home this message, it's often for implementers really difficult ex post to know which household received which intervention at what point in time where. But that's critical information. We really have to know that. Not good enough to say on the north of Syria, you know, we targeted 10,000 households. I need to know the name of the household, the village they were in, the month they received it, and what exactly they received. Yeah. And that is difficult or impossible to collect ex post. That has to be put into the M&E data system and into the monitoring system, and needs to be done as the project unfolds. So I'm really strongly recommend to integrate impact evaluations and research and learning, or whatever you want to call it, into the implementation projects if the implementation team thinks there is a need for generating extra learning. And with that, I thank everybody for listening to our presentation, and maybe hand back to Eduardo for the chairing of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Tilman. Thank you, everyone in the team, for a very interesting presentation. I certainly share your aspiration to evaluate important projects, no matter how difficult or complex they are. And so I think we commend you for doing an excellent job on this particular project. I would like now to invite Hania to provide some comments to the presentation. In the meantime, I see there are a few questions, so that's great. So please do type your questions in the Q&A, and we'll have some time after Hania's to ask some questions to the team. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to take a bit of a different stand. Like I'm taking the other direction, you know, stepping a bit further and seeing the picture from a different angle. Now it's very interesting what was presented, because on the one hand, I mean, Professor Tilman was talking about that everybody is shying away from the main complex of settings, you know, especially in conflict areas. And, you know, it takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of resources, and so we don't do that. While if we look back also at what Dr. Ghattas said, that by 2030, you know, half of the population will be living in conflict settings. So then this is a need, and this is where we need to start working on that. So that was also a comment that I wanted to say. The other thing is that also as much as their diversity of the research that was done on impact of agriculture interventions, on food security, on nutrition and diversity, yet very few was done on conflict or humanitarian settings. So this is where this research came in, as to fill in the gap, and to fill in a gap by choosing the country, which is really where the let's say the intense conflict is happening. And especially that it started since 2011. And the interesting thing is about the use of, let's say, a variety of research methods. So not just relying on one set of research methods, but really integrating different ones, while also trying to cope with the challenges in terms of the weather shocks, the drought, the other challenges that were accompanied, not just in terms of security, but also in terms of the climate. So that was also something. For me, it's very important. I have some key takeout messages. It's that the research showed that there is positive impact in terms of increased, let's say, reliance in moderate settings, and especially among women also. So this is one interesting thing, which then brings me to what if we have more gender mainstreaming of such interventions, where we can look more into a gender lens. How can we improve the support to the woman in such conflict settings? I mean, provided that there's evidence that they do have a positive impact in terms of the food security and also nutrition and diversity. But also when we speak about self-reliance, it also has to do with income generation, to sustain the income. So then also it links to strengthening rural markets. How do we do that when we want to also have a market lens? So also to improve the production that can be sold and that can generate income for the families to invest also in let's say, buying more food commodities and become more food secure. So this is the other message. And then, I mean, let's say the crisis started since 2011, and there's still this all these, let's say, interventions are focused on the humanitarian conflict settings. But is there a need to kind of start also the development approach, not just relying on emergency support, but rather have a mix of both, or continue to focus on emergency? And then especially that we want to, on the policy side, also one of the key takeout messages was to strengthen the adaptive capacities of smallholder farms. So maybe then this is where the cluster interventions would be a good idea. But then how do we strengthen, or do we build the reliance also in terms of having them more climate adaptive at the same time, so that to be also resistance to weather, to the climate change. And last but not least, it's to have, yes, these impact evaluations, to have this teamwork between the researchers, between the implementers, and also between the donors themselves, to be able to, shift the projects to whenever there's more evidence about the impact of such activities, and to have more repeated, let's say, evaluation over a period of time, but rather also to bring a mix of quantitative and qualitative research in that settings, despite maybe sometimes the difficulty of conducting such qualitative research. So I have also some questions that I'd like to ask the presenters maybe, and then open the floor to other questions. So in that thing, I mean, how can we really, in terms of the research, how can we have a more of a gender focused, especially on women in that? I mean, do we have to integrate specific research methods or interventions that are more gender specific in order to evaluate the impact of such interventions? I think Dr. Ghassan?
Yes, thank you, Hania. And so would anyone in the team would like to answer this last question or comment on the previous comments before we open up to the audience?
Tilman, you want to?
Sure, but yeah, you might also want to say something. So thank you. Those are excellent comments, and I appreciate that very much. The question on gender, I think, is critical. And I think what we have to recognize is that we have to go beyond just collecting some data on women, or maybe even more narrow still on just on female-headed households. Yeah, I think that would be far too narrow and wouldn't do justice to the important role of gender in these difficult emergency context. In fact, I think rather than just having sort of some special numbers or some special programs for women as a group, I think we have to really think through what does gender mean for emergency setting and in emergency settings, and for example, in terms of intersectionality, how women in conflict zones are facing not just different circumstances because they're women, not men, but face maybe multiple challenges to their well-being and their livelihoods, because conflict is very gendered, displacement is very gendered, emergencies are gendered, agriculture is very gendered. And so, these are multiple challenges facing people the same way. At the same time, they may face different women differently. So we have a huge amount of heterogeneity among all women. I would actually argue perhaps there's more heterogeneity across women or across men than there is between men and women on average. So I think sort of we need a more feminist approach to programming in emergency settings, much more than we have seen before. And that goes far beyond data and special needs program. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. And in terms of generating, how do you think we can work on generating better evidence for such challenging settings, because these conflicts are always changing? So how do we kind of work on generating more evidence in such settings?
I'm not sure who should answer that. Maybe Hala, but I'm happy to take it. If
That's the advantage and disadvantage of having multiple. I'm happy to answer, and I think this is something kind of was part of what we wanted to actually do instead of say, of course, we can get the perfect study design and tried to implement it there, and of course it didn't work, right? So in principle, I think this is kind of the thing, the challenging, how we can, because there's a, maybe it's kind of a trade-off between how rigorous and how much the perfection of the increase of food security versus actually providing enough rigorous evidence that can show enough learning, if I may, sufficient learning for people to build on. And I think there has to be this kind of a balance point. And I think moving in the future, that we see that using satellite data, which doesn't require people to be on the field, using other type of big data that we use with the weather data, the conflict data, we can help better estimating and the optimal targeting in these regions without having to have specific pilots on purpose, specific targeting. Rest, including qualitative, might be interesting, is something that we have thought about, but it actually has been quite challenging in a context like Syria to have groups of people coming together and agreeing, given the political and the social context that exists there. So that's what's quite the idea, that we might want to bring different types of tools that are in order to build this kind of evidence from different angles and different types of data. So I think there's a potential to do that, and I think this is something that building on this project, something we want to kind of also improve for beyond Syria as well. So this is quite an interesting thing to move forward with. Hala, you want to add something?
No, I think I was just starting to look at the Q&As from the audience and thought perhaps we could start to think about this idea that Tillman mentioned in terms of how do we get this balance right in terms of complexity, but also addressing multiple potentially causal factors in terms of interventions, right? So, you know, seeds plus irrigation, but maybe not beyond. So what are, how do you get to these optimal, and I think that this was one of the questions, how do you get to these optimal levels of complexity in terms of interventions? I think, that is the next big question from my perspective. And I don't know whether we've started to think about, how does one, based on your big tangled thread, pull out not one, but multiple slightly simpler threads that do work together to address some of the core factors that are needed to help households deal in these kinds of situations.
Okay, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Hala and Ghassan. So I think we have some questions that some more questions in the Q&A. So I would like to, so you I think of answer the question from Sarah and Andrew somehow. So you actually, you rephrase the question really, rather than answering. And so I guess you're saying that's more for, for, say, what people say, for future research. I mean, it's for be able to disentangle and to simplify the level of complexity. There is a second question, which is about data, and is asking how were you able to, ask not just interview 1,000 people, but doing it 4 times in a conflict area. So it must be very challenging. So if you can say a bit more about this, and if I may add, I would like to ask a question which is slightly related. Is that in addition, so you show the result, which is great, that besides there are positive impacts of intervention, right? So that's fantastic news. But so you're showing the results looking at the household data, like the food consumption index and so on, and then positive results again using village level data through remote sensing. And now I guess the 2 sets of data give similar results, but how do you, so my question was, how do you need to reconcile the data anyway, or are there contradictions between the data? And related to that, whether the remote sensing data alone would be sufficient to tell us about the impact, because if that was the case, we would not need to interview 1,000 people 4 times. So grateful if you can say something more about data collection. Thank you.
Thanks, Edward. I'm happy to take the data questions since I've been going 4 years through that, and I'm happy then to link to Lara to add something on the remote sensing. But I think what we did, the problem for us in Syria was not attrition, right? Because the FAO have been worked with its beneficiaries. We have identified the control groups. I think kind of the systems, even in FAOs. Through them, we have done also the data collection in Syria, which was kind of very well coordinated in a sense, and actually reaching these households, the team is really strong. So this is what I think what Tillman backs, without having the good implementers, it's really hard for us as researchers to go there and do so. What was our biggest issue was just the changing assignment of the beneficiaries, right? Like, so, because given that so we cannot plan 4 years ahead who's going to receive all these types of interventions and then make sure that they follow, but these have been changing all the time. So that was kind of the challenge that we had, but we decided regardless if these households who had that baseline, that they were not beneficial anymore, to continue with them and study them. So we are part of the control group, which we use in our propensity score matching. So yes, it is a challenging environment, but of course it depends on I think the team that they work and how they manage the data. That's something that we also had obtained approvals. Some took lots of time. Lots of questionnaires have been kind of disapproved, but kind of we try to simplify the questionnaire and keep it to the point that for us to get good data, quality data, that without having to compromise. So one has to do trade-offs, so to speak, in order to kind of maximize the way you can do it. Linking to the other point of what Eduardo's been saying, and I think we were not able to do so. And I think this is what goes back to one of Tillman's point, because FAO at the time, given this emergency, they wanted to reach more people with different types of interventions. And because we saw effects in I think it's kind of the conclusion came from agriculture and we saw it from seeds, if you put them together, we might have seen much more stronger effects. And this is why we think about the clustering, rather than having different beneficiaries with different types of support. Unfortunately, we cannot test it because it's different areas. So we don't have information from the villages. We had the satellites where the irrigation rehabilitation took place. So we didn't have a sample of, it was actually difficult to access this area. So this was kind of one of the things that we thought that might be interesting, especially for the irrigation rehabilitation. But I think from a remote sensing perspective, maybe Lara can add something, is that this is something what we call ground truthing, to make sure that we see it as it is from satellite data. How can we ground truth? And I think this is something we haven't tested particularly in the study, but that's something that's really needed, and see how, if we can use other types of data that we don't, maybe we can help predict how survey data, how we can replace survey data to a certain extent. And I think this is kind of the challenge for people working in a humanitarian setting in the next 5 to 10 years. And I think the evidence is kind of also the efforts are moving in that direction, so to speak.
Thank you. And we have another question about data from Andrew. So Andrew is pointing out that the sample size was not huge. And would you say, so are there any statistical power issue here? Like, for example, you're not finding effects in some cases. Could that be down to the small sample size? Or how are you confident that your results are not driven by small sample bias?
Yes, indeed. I think it's for our food consumption score and resilience. I think we did expose based after the attrition, we were kind of sure that this should be enough on the average treatment effects. For agricultural production, we were careful. That's why we don't show much results, because different farmers grow different crops, so even the sample size is a little bit more shedded, if I may. So this is something we don't detect enough power. So we want to be careful about understanding the pathways through agricultural production that we couldn't test very carefully. But actually, with the heterogeneous treatment effects, using this machine learning, as I said, kind of the more data you give it, of course, the more precise the estimates are. But also, it doesn't require, because it's how it works, it doesn't require too much high sampling. Like if you want to do a normal subsampling analysis, for example, to look at heterogeneous effects, which requires quadruple the amount of sampling, right? Like even in a normal traditional way. So this helps us make sure that all these findings, these heterogeneous impacts are important, are significant. How much the causality plays there, of course, and the power about the detection might be something that one has to really consider in a bigger setting and test those issues with a bigger sample, right? So, but of course, there's always this kind of challenges of the sample size. And as I said, so if we want to cover all the interventions and all the interactions of the interventions of the program, would have needed and I think this is something financially and both logistically, it's probably a bigger challenge than what's already is. Thank you.
Thank you, Ghassan. We have a question from Samuel. clustering interventions seem to have parallels with picking winners in industry, or Yuan Ang's interpretation of allowing regional divergence in China's past. Personally, I'm not sure I'm able to follow this, but what are the ethical implications of development practitioners picking winners at the household level?
I'm happy to try to take that, although I'm not familiar with China's economic development, so I have to answer part of that question only. But I think it's not so much about picking winners. So it's not saying, you know, we could do 10 different things. Let's do the one thing that we know will work, as opposed to the 9 things we know will not work. Well, that was difficult. So that's not what it's about. What it's about is to say, if you're in a fragile setting, you face a host of challenges, you know, or especially in an insecure environment as well. Yeah. And just to quickly go through them here, you know, there's a government that doesn't support its population in a proactive and positive and altruistic way. There's violence from multiple actors. There's massive displacement. There's extreme poverty. There's climate shocks. There's a macroeconomic crisis in Lebanon. There is a global sort of geopolitical situation which is difficult. You know, there's Iran, there's Turkey, and it goes on and on. You know, each one of these things. Oh, there's COVID. Yeah, I forgot my list of disasters. So, you know, each one of these challenges is a big challenge and has its own literature. Yeah, but if you put all of them together, it gets really difficult. Now, what makes us think that by providing one type of support, you know, we're likely to help households a lot? Now, actually, interestingly, some of our research shows that there were some massive constraints where providing one type of support, like seeds, actually did help. But that was probably context specific because of the nature of the seed system in Syria, which was a real bottleneck. But generally speaking, you know, we need help on multiple fronts. You know, we need help on agricultural input, but also on markets, maybe, you know, maybe some training, maybe some credit, maybe, you know, whatever it might be. Yeah. And so I think my point is, if we offer a bundle of interventions, to households in a given region, then both do we bring the individual household across some poverty threshold or, you know, minimum asset threshold or anything like that. Plus, we may have macroeconomic sort of general equilibrium effects in that village from having a more sustained intervention. So maybe, if anything, it's about picking villages that you want to succeed or districts that you want to succeed, you know, rather than having a nationwide, everybody gets $1 worth of help. Yeah, because we can see how that doesn't structurally help anything. And let's remember that conflict and insecurity and fragility lead to structural change. The war economy in Syria has led to a structural change of the economy. So if we want to help and support, we also have to induce structural change. And I think that's key. It's not about improving, you know, the amount of food by one person in 1 year. It's about actually ultimately building new structures which are more inclusive to help people take care of themselves. And that sort of goes then the direction of resilience, but it needs a multi-pronged approach in my view. Yeah, which at the same time is not too complex or complicated. Yeah, so that's the challenge and that's the trade-off, but we can't escape that. I think there's no easy escape. Yeah, over.
Thank you, Tilman. Andrew is asking, so why the intervention doesn't have an impact on villages or households in areas that are most affected by conflict. And so you're showing this chart, very, very nice, where, you know, the intervention is very effective in sort of middle range between, so it is not particularly effective on people highly affected by conflict or not affected by conflict at all. But of course, it's particularly worrying that it's not helping much those more. So why is that the case? That intervention is not particularly effective in the most affected areas, and what could be done in those areas? So if the intervention is not effective, what alternative interventions or initiatives could be undertaken in those areas?
Thank you, Eduardo. I'm happy to take that. Hello, that's fine. So my feeling is that it was hard for us to say what's the best alternative intervention, but in principle, we know from other evidence that cash usually in high intense areas with lots of displacement, where it's driven by conflict, usually has positive impacts, right? So we know that cash works in these areas. There's been lots of evidence in the past 5 years that has been showing that. And that's why we wanted to test in the beginning. So at which point we're giving seeds, which is something that requires people to settle, to grow, to wait for a whole harvest season to harvest them, right? So, and where we have high intensity conflict, where displacements might take place, looting might take place. Yeah, so there's other correlated with other issues that might not let farmers be able to be as productive and gain from the season itself. So that's the high intensity conflict. But we don't find it in the no conflict at all. We think that might seed it's not enough. Yeah. So the control group has found in a peaceful setting other alternative income generating activities to improve their food security, right? Versus the seed. So we might need to create much more, as Tillman said, bundling this maybe specific interventions together to build stronger market access to improve it in these peaceful settings, because you have the potential to start building into the development area where the high conflict is still more humanitarian, but where we find the seeds in itself at the small intervention and would provide provision inputs works in these areas where are in between, so to speak. Yeah, so where I think it's not a kind of disaster in this sense. So that's why I think you cannot, one program might work in one setting, but might work not in another setting. And I think this is kind of what we wanted to bring through, that we need to kind of refine these things to know exactly what type of programming under what type of circumstances might have better impact and give more benefits to household living under these extreme conditions.
Thank you, Ghassan. And I don't see other questions at the moment. So maybe I'll ask another question while maybe people still have time to type some other question. So I do have a question about, because Tillman, at the end you mentioned the sort of, so you were saying having a long horizon for humanitarian interventions. And so my question is a bit more about this particular intervention. To what extent is a long-term solution, and to what extent is addressing just a contingent problem? And so it's basically, I'd like to know more about what the project is about, because so you're saying there are seeds and tools, and I understand they're addressing an immediate emergency, but how confident you are they're building something which is sustainable in the future? So to what extent is it a long-term initiative?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Excellent question. So I think the one key topic is that the distinction between short-term emergency and long-term development is completely misleading, outdated, and superfluous. And I think the fact that our aid infrastructure is divided into these two pillars is extremely counterproductive and should be changed. The point being that if you ask a poor or hungry family or person in Syria, what do you want and what do you need and what should happen, they're not going to tell you, well, on the humanitarian side I'd like this, and on the development side I'd like that. They want to have certainty that they have enough food, they want a job, they want their kids to go to school, they want safety, they want peace. Yeah, they want to be able to make their own decisions. Okay, these are all dimensions of human development and of development. But emergencies and conflict and fragility and all these things, insecurity, as I said earlier, structurally change our economies. So if you address a structural change with some short-term, plaster, of course, it might save a life in the short term, but that life, sort of is only worth saving if A, it can continue living, and B, it can live, independently and without worry about hunger, etc. Like I said before, yeah. So we need to always connect the two, yeah, the saving lives with the, why are we saving this life, yeah, so that people can lead meaningful lives again and go on and do whatever they want to do, yeah, so that they're free. And so I really think we need to think this people-centric and not donor-centric. And I think we really have to connect the present with the future. And if you plant a seed and it helps a family to, for example, as we found, stop girl marriages, then you structurally change a life of that girl and of her future children and of her future family, right? So, planting some seeds, to stick with that metaphor on the topic of our project, can have long-term, even intergenerational impacts. So the short-term and the long-term are connected. Yeah, they're part of the same chain. And I think we don't pay enough attention to that, both in research and in programming. And yeah, I think our research shows how closely these are connected, actually. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Tilman. We have another question from Andrew, is about the actual size of the impact of the intervention. So whether you can compare your results to results of other studies, and are you able to say, for example, well, the impact was very large or not so large in comparison to other studies, other contexts?
Well, I'm happy to take that. I think we so again I think this is kind of, we want to go back and say that yes, definitely the ways we're saying that the context really matters, and I think this is, as we want to show that even like the effect size within Syria at different levels between males and females have lots of variation, right? So, and I think this is something what we want to kind of bring through, is that if not everybody benefits equally. I think this is kind of the message we want to say, but I'm sure. So as if you look at the baseline values, if you look at the food consumption score and the RCSI, actually in Syria from when we started the study are not very low. They cannot be compared, for example, to lower food consumption in sub-Saharan Africa, South Sudan, for example, Yemen, right? So there's this extremely emergency situation type of situations. So usually where such smaller programs find larger effect size, compared to more peaceful, we usually quite more similar. So I think we look at around 12-13% increase in the food consumption score, which is something that means on average it's around 1 or 1.5 maybe food group per day, right? So this is something that I think usually it's a setting where we provide more vegetables, something what we kind of also expect around those levels. So it's not really high. So it's not, because like even we look at when it broke down over the results, we saw that Syria's people still consumed it fully, right? Before and after. So we don't find effects there because everybody eats Syria's, and something in Syria that something has still been provided, so to speak. But we find it is within this nutrition meat and within fruits, and this is where kind of the effects we measure that was quite expected in comparison to other studies.
So it is actually quite comparable to, for example, the impact of cash interventions in Lebanon for Syrian refugees on food consumption score. The effect size is actually quite similar. So clearly cash has other pathways and is working through different pathways in a different context. But if you look at the same outcome within a similar population, so Syrians displaced to Lebanon, the effect sizes are actually quite similar across those two settings.
Thank you, Hala. Thank you, Ghassan. Well, actually, thank you, everyone. I think this was probably the last question. And someone asked earlier on whether there is a paper. And so there is an evaluation report that will be published on the SEDIL website. And but I know the team is also working on one or more papers. So maybe this is the time for you to advertise some of your work. So if there is a paper available coming up soon, please go ahead and tell us.
Sure, we can, if you go to our website,
okay,
we can find, if you go to the program, you can find the program. We have some evidence briefs and working papers that related to this workshop and this program that we have there. And some of these papers were going to be, some are under review and some will be published in academic journals. And as Eduardo said, at the end of the SEDIL program, we will have for each project specific detailed, so that might come also soon as well.
Wonderful. And so this was the last question. And so with this, we're going to bring the seminar to a close. I'd like to thank all the participants and all people for attending. And as I remember, there is an evaluation form, and at the end for participants to please leave us some feedback. And I also want to say that this is the last seminar of the year. And but we'll be back in January. We have a seminar on the 26th of January. A team from IFPRI, led by Claudia Ringler, will present on the impact of the Working Freedom Project, migration intervention on migration, women's migration between Asia and the Middle East. So that's another interesting study that I invite everyone to attend. And with this, again, thank you everyone for this excellent presentation. Thank you everyone for attending. Bye, everyone.